Well, here we're dealing with fall protection. So this first picture is showing you the good, and that this is basically proper personal fall arrest equipment here going on, being used. And here we've got places where ladders are not particularly being used properly. We've seen this picture before, but there's lots of things wrong in this picture. We'll deal with this picture in a little more detail when we get to ladders and stairways. But here's a fella from around 1931 sitting on a corner of the Empire State Building. And again, no fall protection, no hard hat, no real personal protective equipment beyond maybe some kind of basic boots that I'm sure were not steel-toed, and some gloves. But ultimately, if you're working at elevation, your tool should be tethered so that if you drop the wrench, it doesn't land somewhere down below, killing somebody or hurting somebody. And here's some pictures from that famous day that the famous photographer was taking these pictures, and they're just posing for the picture. But there is no net, there is no fall protection. Whereas this picture is in a studio. It's a famous enough picture that they staged it. They're inches off the ground. But back to the people back in 31. Here they are hemming it up again by pretending to nap on that girder. But at the same time, there is no net, so there is real risk there. Okay, so things have changed a little bit since then as far as our understanding and our best practices dealing with occupational safety. But here, back in 2010, when they were building a little bitty steel building at the south end of campus, they didn't seem to have caught any of those lessons. So they're using safety zip ties, if there is such a thing, holding that pallet on forks. So that's not a proper lift for human or personnel lift, to just use a pallet like that. And here's an OSHA file photo where someone is on the wrong side of the guardrails, but the guardrails aren't complete. The mid-rail is not installed. Maybe he took it off, for all I know, to work out there. But anyways, so falls are the leading cause of fatalities in construction. These are the top four types of classifications of fatalities in the construction industries, where falls are more than a third, at about 35% of the fatalities in the construction industry every year. Being struck by an object or something, that's about 10% or so, and electrocution is third at around 9%. Sometimes they crisscross over, and sometimes electrocutions are second. But generally we consider struck bys to be second, electrocutions to be third, and then the distant fourth is the caught in or caught between. So we've talked about the struck bys and the caught in betweens already. Now we're going to falls. So that's the theme here. Now, related to falls, we'll also deal with ladders and stairways, and then scaffolding, because they're related to falls or working at elevations. And so we'll move to that topic after this. But first of all, dealing with falls. So this fella, and I've done it, I've been here before, where you get up on a roof, you usually need to get somewhere to do something at the edge or something, but he's relying completely on the friction of his butt with that roof. And that's just not a good situation to put yourself in. You've got no way to, if you start to slide off of that roof, and you know, there can be grit on the roof, sandy particles from the roofing materials that literally act like little ball bearings, so you can suddenly start sliding on roofs pretty easily. I know from experience. So most fatalities occur when employees fall from open-sided floors and through floor openings in general. So when you've got any kind of floor openings, and in residential construction, it happens all the time, where you have a floor that you frame up an opening in for stairs, a big stairwell opening. And then you finally go and build the stairs or install the stairs. But even then, you can fall through the sides around that thing because you still haven't maybe built walls around that opening or guardrails and such. So stairway openings are a particular danger, that you can forget the opening is there and then accidentally step right through it. So we've got to put guardrails up around stairwell openings in construction sites until everything is properly built in the way it's supposed to be. And there's other things that can happen in commercial buildings. Besides stairwell openings, you can have elevator shaft openings where you're going to put the elevator shaft eventually. You can have other kinds of openings for building services, that ductwork and plumbing and stuff, where there's opening in floors for stuff like that to pass through. And that's another place where you can fall through, or at least trip. If it's not big enough to be considered a floor opening that a person can fall through, it can be considered a floor hole that can trip you up and still get you hurt. So we consider the basic rules of rule of construction safety as being 6 feet, the 6-foot rule, that you must be protected from falling more than 6 feet. In general industry, if you're not specifically doing construction, then we have to fall back on the general industry rule, and that's a 4-foot rule, that you must be protected from falling more than 4 feet. But either way, those are definitely important numbers to remember. That for most of the time when we're talking in this course, it'll be a 6-foot rule, the 6-foot number, because we're generally dealing with construction. The section that deals with construction, fall protection and protecting people from falling and such, would be subpart M. So there's the letter, but then the actual numbers would be 1926 500 through 503. So when you're dealing with the assignment that deals with this topic, remember that that's subpart M. I think is useful to know, but the main thing is knowing that range of numbers, because that'll help you to answer those questions or to find that section. Subpart, it's 29 Code of Federal Regulations, 1926, of course, because that's construction, and then the decimal place is the important part to remember here, 500 through 503. So that only represents about 7 or 8 pages, and maybe a dozen pages of appendices of tables and charts and things. So it's not a huge section, but is maybe one of the most important sections within the construction standards. So, you can get somebody who was just scraping away here, doing mindless work and humming a happy tune. And maybe he was doing this on the ground floor earlier in the day, and he could literally forget that he's up on the second floor after lunch, get a little sleepy. You could literally step off that floor. It doesn't seem possible but when you're right next to something and you just don't think. And so, yes, or no, maybe it was the right thing to say. No, you cannot be working up here without guardrails or being tied off. He's too close to an unprotected edge. So there's a lot of sections that we have fall protection notations in, or special exceptions or special rules for different areas besides subpart M. We've got the steel erection section is maybe the biggest area, subpart R, that deals with structural steel erection. And so that's 1926 760 is that main section. And so those are the craziest exceptions. If you'll step down 2 sub-bullets down to deckers, where you see that it says up to 15 feet for deckers. They're allowed to work up to, if you're putting decking down on elevated level, as you build a structural steel building, you eventually have to put decking down. They're allowed to work up to 15 feet or 1 story, whichever comes first, without fall protection. And then I mentioned in there a controlled decking zone. We'll come back to look at that again, CDZ. So when you see CDZ, that's the abbreviation for controlled decking zone. But above that one, that bullet, that little sub-bullet, it's talking about the connectors. Well, the connectors are those that connect the beams and the columns together to make the basic frame that the deck goes on. And so they're bolting these things generally together, and then maybe coming back and welding them. But they're allowed to work up to 30 feet, 30 feet, or 2 stories, whichever comes first, without fall protection. So that's crazy talk. There's no way that you can safely fall 30 feet and expect to get up and walk again, at least anytime soon. So those are just grandfathered in, and so what happens is, the reality is that OSHA can still issue citations even when they're following these rules, if, in their opinion, they could have added additional fall protection and just didn't. If it was reasonable in their mind that you should have fall protection. So the rules are not completely a license to work at 30 feet in the air. There's other exceptions for scaffolding. You'll see when we get to scaffolding, their basic fall protection rule for requiring guardrails on scaffolding is 10 feet. So we have a 10-foot exception, basically, for scaffolds. Now, people who have worked in the petrochemical industry in the plants say that just can't be, because they don't generally follow those kinds of lax rules in the plants. They have much stronger rules. They will follow much higher best practices than that. Cranes and derricks, there's some rules about that. There's some things for the people that are climbing electrical transmission towers and distribution towers and cell towers and that sort of thing. There's some special exceptions on fall protection in the stairways and ladders section that we'll come to. So we're going to come to the stairways and ladders section next after this fall protection, and we'll deal with scaffolding after that. And there's some special exceptions for inspectors that are inspecting job sites or conducting accident investigations or assessing workplace conditions in some fashion. So it just means that when you look in the index of the construction standards or in the general industry standards, you're going to find that besides having a basic fall protection area, they will have other areas within the book where they come up when you're in that area. And it just means that you have to follow the fall protection standard unless there's something that conflicts with that within the other section of the kind of work you're actually doing. So if you're doing ironwork, steel erection, then you're going to be you can follow the rules that are within that area, but you've also got to pay attention to all the rules that are in subpart M for the basic fall protection standard. Okay, that's enough about this. But the basic rule up at the top, you see 6-foot rule. Anything 6 feet or more in height must be guarded with railings. You must be tied off with some sort of a personal fall arrest system that's tied off to something that can support 5,000 pounds for each person attached. Or safety nets. So those are the three choices. Let's see, I've got the next page here. I'm looking at a couple of iron workers, and at first I thought they had personal fall arrest systems that just weren't connected to anything, but no, those are just suspenders holding up their tool belts. So again, they're up quite a ways, and they're not using any fall protection of any kind. So you're at risk of falling when you're working on scaffolding, when you're working on ladders, when you're around leading edges, probably of decking. Typically, when you're installing the decking, the edge that you keep installing more sheets of corrugated steel decking or plywood sheets up on a residential roof or deck, that's the leading edge that you're installing stuff in. Or with ramps and runways. With a ramp, you start off at, right at the ground, and you just gradually go up higher and higher, and next thing you know, you're at some elevation that you can fall that could hurt you or worse. Floor or wall openings, they become, of course, a hazard. We talked about that a moment ago. Roofs that you can fall off. Or openings in roofs, for instance. Just like floor openings, there can be roof openings, such as where the chimney goes. You don't have a chimney to begin with. You typically have an opening for the chimney to be in, to come through, and then you build the chimney up and out. There can be excavations. You start off with a field that's nice and level and flat, and once you dig a hole, you've got some place that you can fall into. Or pits or wells. Concrete forms are a common issue needing fall protection. That tall wall forms, when if you've dealt with little curb forms for slab on grade, that's, you're not at any elevation. But when you start building an 8-foot, 10-foot, 12-foot, higher than that even, concrete wall form, you've got to get up there with scaffolding in order to be able to pour the concrete in that form. But plenty of residential sites and some commercial sites, they will have people climb up on top of there and walk like a circus act on top of that wall form to pour the concrete, kind of hanging on to the concrete pump or something. Okay, so here's an OSHA file photo before the citation where they were issued a citation for not having proper fall protection. So yes, they do visit residential sites. Here's a ramp, and again, as you climb up, this one's got proper toe board, top rail, mid rail, and toe board on it. So for a construction site, this is acceptable. It might not be acceptable. Well, it's not going to be acceptable for the general public, but for people working on construction sites, OSHA's basic rules allow this. Now here I'm looking at something that we'll look at in more detail again when we get to the suspended scaffolding section with scaffolding. But this cartoon or this drawing is showing two workers, one that's tied off properly and one who doesn't even have a harness on, let alone be tied off. And so when the suspended scaffolding fails, and it only has to fail on one side to have failed, one person is saved because he's tied off to an independent lifeline, and the other person has gone down and one's alive, one's not. So that's in this little drawing. What I would just point out is it actually happened here in Baton Rouge back in 2013 at Our Lady of the Lake Hospital. They were building this tower that you see here in the background where they're installing some windows still. And literally the suspended scaffolding that they were using to install the windows failed on one side just like that. So here it is. You see it dangling. Well, and you don't see any people because this is the last picture they took when it was taken after they rescued the three people who were on this. So here's a picture of the three people. There's two out in the open there, dangling on their lifeline with because of, and their lives saved because of the suspended, because of the personal fall arrest system, the safety harness, the lanyard that's attached to a lifeline rope, and the third person is over there, kind of tangled up in or able to be a little bit more comfortable standing on portions of what's left of the suspended scaffolding. So I'll talk about this when we get in more detail when we get to the scaffolding section here, but on that particular presentation. But one thing I would just point out I didn't see for a while when I would look at these pictures is their buddies are peeking through the windows at them from inside the building here. I didn't notice that until later here, and you can kind of see them all peeking out here. But anyways, they were all saved. The whole thing is that there's something called suspension trauma. When you're dangling in a safety harness, there's the pelvic straps are tightening up on your legs and kind of like a tourniquet does, and so toxins can build up in the pooled blood in your legs and clotting can happen, and so you're particularly at danger once they rescue you, where suddenly that blood can flow through and cause a stroke or shut down organs and all kinds of things that I can't possibly know any more details about because I'm not a medical professional or anything. But the suspension trauma is a very real and serious thing. When you're dangling in a harness, you can't be there long. They say you have to have them rescued within 15 minutes. Generally, they say a range of 10 to 15 minutes. So we're not talking, you can't go shopping for equipment to go and rescue these people. You have to already have that ready to use immediately after the fall. Okay, so there's the last picture of them up there dangling away. So you see how far they were up. It would have been certain death to have fallen. So besides number 2, then what we just looked at, the personal fall arrest system, or abbreviated PFAS for personal fall arrest system, we have another way, and that's the guardrails that I mentioned a few moments ago, or a safety net. So those are the 3 forms. OSHA says you have to use one of these forms at least. In many cases in the petrochemical industry, in the plants, they will, in the construction work that goes on there, they will often use 2. So that's a best practice that exceeds OSHA's minimum standards, but it just kind of proves a point about, when you're talking about the most likely way for a fatality to happen on your job site, happening from falling, then protecting people from falling by double protection doesn't seem like a bad idea. So let's look at guardrails first. So the standard height of a guardrail is 42 inches. You need to know that number. The mid-rail is half of 42 inches, so that's 21 inches. And then the toe board needs to be right at the ground within an 1/8 inch, really, no gap. You want it tight to the ground. So the toe boards must be at least 3.5 inches tall, or the height of them. Well, that's the height of a 2x4, the width of a 2x4, but when it's laying on sideways, I guess you could call it the height. And these guardrails have to be strong enough that you can push or pull at the top rail with a force of 200 pounds and nothing's coming apart. So you remember a few moments ago I just mentioned how when you're tied off for your support, when you're tied off to something, you have to be able to you must be tied off to something that can support 5,000 pounds for each worker attached to that tie-off point, to that beam or whatever you're tied off to. And meanwhile, I'm talking about 200 pounds. But if you actually try to go over to a wall and push with 200 pounds of force, you'll be surprised how hard that is to push with a 200-pound force. Pulling, you might be able to do it if you can push against something and pull. You might be able to pull something apart, but even that's a significant force. So it's a stronger force than it might initially seem. Now, this open guardrail system is only meant to protect you. If there's people working down below you, then this needs to be screened in so that there's no openings, no holes in this guardrail. And all your tools had to be tethered, tied off in a way where they can't drop on somebody below. Materials included, tools and materials. One other thing I didn't mention is that there's a range here. The 42-inch number, the height of these guardrails, is something you need to remember. That's the number to remember. But there's also a range. They talk about plus or minus 3 inches. So really it's between 39 and 45 inches. And the thing is that 39 inches is really barely adequate because you're trying to get the center of gravity of each person working there, make sure that the center of gravity of that person is below the top rail. So some people that are very tall, 42 inches might be a borderline, and maybe 45 inches would be better. So you find in some areas where you'll find that guardrails are now kind of being put at 45 inches instead. Okay, so here's an unprotected edge, and this guy cannot be working on this deck. Now, I know I would feel quite comfortable to work on this deck. You know, you're very comfortable with heights, but sometimes you can be irrationally comfortable with heights. From your experience of just never having any trouble, but it only takes one bad day, one bad moment where this guy forgets where he's at and steps off that edge. Because, you know, if he's inside, you look at this, you might have been on the ground floor all morning and you get upstairs on the second floor now, and with the glare on your safety glasses and stuff, you may still think you're on the ground floor and forget that you just climbed up to all the apartments look the same, you know. Okay, this is an OSHA file photo where OSHA didn't like this 1/4-inch nylon rope being employed as a guardrail. It's a long ways down, and that's not really a guardrail at all. And this wrinkled the brow, I guess you'd say, of an OSHA inspector, because this is not a proper scaffolding system. Yes, it looks pretty good compared to some kinds of things that I've had to climb on for concrete forms in my youth, but no, it's not considered effective guardrails. There's something to hang on to maybe on one side if you're lucky, but it's not adequate. And when you dig a hole in an excavation, you've got to put guardrails at the top of that hole to keep people from falling in there. Generally, at excavations, everything needs to be kept at least 2 feet back, and there's several problems in this picture. Yeah, no, there's no guardrails, so the guardrails would have to be 2 feet back from the top edge, from that edge. But also the pile of dirt that's piling up there, there's chunks and lumps of things that can fall down in it. All that was supposed to be kept at least 2 feet back from the edge of the excavation. So they didn't get that right either. Oh, and this excavation is not shored up properly. We'll get into that topic in several topics away from now. We'll get into the excavations along with confined spaces. So there's no shoring, there's no egress. Well, everybody knows egress, that's those pretty white birds, right? No, that's egrets. Okay, so egress is a term that's used for entry and exit. In safety, most of the time, our big issue, safety-wise, is exiting in an emergency. Well, that means generally in excavations having ladders, and there's no ladders to be found anywhere here. You've got to have a ladder within 25 feet of you at all times when you're in an excavation, or up on a roof for that matter. So, no guardrails here either. Now, it used to be that a personal fall arrest system included body belts, and they're still in the category, and they can still make them and sell them, and people can still use them, but only for fall restraint. So you see that in the headline on this page. Body belts are designed to restrain a person in a hazardous work position, to keep them from even getting to a place where they can fall. So as of January 1st, 1998, which is a while ago, they are not allowed to be used for fall protection, only for fall restraint. So that's why they're still allowed to be out there, but just be very careful. It's not something that you can use to protect somebody from falling. The actual fall protection has to be a full body harness like we've been seeing in some pictures here. And I'll show you something here. So here's one, kind of suspended in midair, but it basically has pelvic straps that go around your legs. And then it's got at least a mid-waist strap. Some of them will have a chest strap and a waist strap. In some of the newer pictures. And on the other side of that orange plate that you see there, that's an orange metal plate, there is a big D-ring that you tie off to connect to a lanyard like you see on the right-hand side of this page. So these are synthetic webbed lanyards here, and they've got the safety hook so that it doesn't accidentally come unhooked on you. And in both cases, they have bundled up webbing that they stitch together, and that becomes a deceleration device. Because so it's meant for a single-use fall. You fall once, well, then you need to replace that unit, that lanyard. In fact, if you fall once, all of your gear has to be replaced. It's a single-use item for falling and supporting weight. But it's designed so that the belting or the webbing of this synthetic strap will unstitch as you fall, and so it slows you down rather than coming to the end of a chain where it's going to be so much blunt force on your body that you'll be injured. There's a few terms here to know about fall protection. So the free fall distance is the first one, and you see my pair of red asterisks here. It's the free fall distance maximum is 2 feet. So that's an important number for you to remember. So we had a 6-foot rule, but we have a 2-foot free fall rule here. So you can freely fall before a deceleration device activates to slow you down, no more than 2 feet. So that's the free fall distance. A deceleration device would be something like a shock absorbing lanyard, like I just mentioned back in this picture here. Or a self-retracting lifeline, well, I'll have to show you, but a self-retracting lifeline kind of operates like your seat belt in a car, where it freely moves in and out until there's a sudden motion in the car. So there's a self-retracting lifeline does that too, so it'll lock right away. So it's an incredibly wonderful invention in that it often prevents the fall from really ever occurring, because it locks up so quickly that you recover yourself without actually going over the edge. The deceleration distance, OSHA says that shall be no more than 3.5 feet. So there's another number, 3.5 feet maximum. So notice this, that 2 feet plus 3.5 feet is 5.5 feet, which is less than 6 feet, which is our basic fall protection rule. So that's not an accident. So the idea of the free fall distance and the deceleration distance combined being something slightly less than 6 feet is not an accident. They're all tied together on that rule. We have another rule about 2 feet, and that's about a personal positioning system. I don't have it written on this page, but I need to mention it here. 2 feet for that rule too, and that's the idea that you shouldn't be tied off somewhere off horizontally away from you, because then when you fall, you end up being thrown sideways and slam into a post, a column, a wall, or something, whatever is in the path. So that's another 2-foot rule. And then the last item on here is also for sure going to show up at a test near you. It's about the arresting force. So that arresting force, the force needed to stop a person from falling, something that can arrest your fall. So the greater the free fall distance, the more force that will be needed to arrest that fall. And so that's partly why they wanted it at 3.5 feet. You know, the acceleration of gravity is 32 feet per second per second. So it keeps increasing by another 32 feet every second that you are falling. You go faster and faster until wind friction takes over and limits your speed. But so don't get tricked by the arresting force being called the deceleration force. That kind of describes it, but I've got a mean possible choice in there that you might see on a test or the quiz questions when you start looking at them, and that's meant to remind you that what it's really called is the arresting force. Yes, you have a deceleration device like the lanyard or the yo-yo. The yo-yo is the nickname for the self-retracting lifeline that I was talking about up top there in the second main bullet. But the arresting force is the force needed to stop a person from falling. On that page at the very bottom, you see where OSHA actually has little rules about, they're just interesting. I'm not making it a testable point, but you should not experience any more than 1,800 pounds of force for the body harness. And so that also means that your acceleration force is never going to get close to the 5,000 pound mark. There's other things that go on in that equation, such as you could be falling with something else in your hands that's weighing more. For instance, way back when we were looking at the suspended scaffolding pictures, you could be tangled up in that suspended scaffolding structure, superstructure, and so that all the weight of that superstructure is on your lifeline. And so that's why we have a 5,000 pound rule. When I first got involved in the safety business here, the rule used to be back in a couple of decades ago, used to be 3,000 pounds. And they changed it to 5,000 pounds because 3,000 wasn't enough. There were people dying that aren't dying anymore because we have the 5,000 pound rule. Okay, so here's the safety harness as a drawing again, and you see that you've got to have these straps tight enough that you can't get any more than 2 fingers underneath the strap. So they need to be tight so that the safety harness doesn't fall off. And on the back, you see the D-ring. That needs to be high enough on your shoulders, between your shoulder blades, so that you're going to be dangling upright. So at least as high as they have it set up here. So in this picture, I thought I was seeing something dangerous, but in reality, it was they were actually pretty much doing most things right in this picture. This particular safety harness they're using, though, is not like the harnesses we've been looking at. We've been looking at what we call, in these other pictures back here, the Class 3 harness that is meant only for fall protection, only. Whereas what they're using here are what we consider Class 4 safety harnesses, where you can work out of them, that you can sit in them. It's meant for you to work and be suspended while you work, like they're doing here to install this sign. These sign parts. And so a Class 4 harness can be used for this purpose, but you still end up being tied off twice. If you see, they've got the orange line that's supporting their weight, and then they've got the white lines, the white rope, vertical lifelines that they're tied off to, that are meant for the emergency if anything goes wrong with the other line. So they're being supported continuously by the orange one, orange lines, and then the other one is the emergency line. And so when you're dealing with a Class 4 harness, you're going to be tied off twice. Okay, here's an OSHA file photo where somebody, they have this big rectangular in front of their face because they didn't get permission to take a picture. But he's not on what we would call approved scaffolding, not approved, and he is wearing a harness, and he is tied off to something inside that house. Now, the problem is, it's likely when he falls, it's going to yank that glass out. And it's not going to be safety glass, I'm certain of that. So you'll have shards of glass raining down upon this guy as he's down below. The other thing is there likely even anything in there that you could tie off to that can support 5,000 pounds? Really should have a tie off from the roof above him instead, because you shouldn't be tied off to something below you. You should be tied off with your line going upwards, not downwards like this. So here he is actually at work, and you can better see that D-ring, and you can kind of see the process here. At the other end, at the same job site, you got his buddy here with the same nail gun holding technique, and his chest strap isn't even connected. Oh, and he's tied off to this white rope that you see here that's dangling on the ladder that he's standing on. And that rope is tied up to that 2x4 that's up fairly high. But because there's so much rope here as his lanyard, I guess you call it, or his lifeline, that he's likely to hit the ground before the thing even tightens up. So, yes, there's no way that he's supported by 5,000 pounds with that 2x4 that he's got his rope looped over. It's just a decoration. This next picture, they got the buddy system, so that's not ideal. And then I was taking this picture one day. I was meaning to take pictures of all these houses in this little subdivision right beside Independence Park on Lobdale. They all were done this same way, when they're up like 14 feet in the air and with no fall protection, and that's not really a proper scaffolding. It's basically some 2x8s or 2x6s supported by a bunch of long unbraced 2x4s. It's just crazy. As far as I know, nothing bad ever happened to them, but it's not a proper system. Okay, and I didn't notice this guy was waving at me later too, until I saw it on the computer later. Okay, so a personal fall arrest system. You need to remember this abbreviation, which I guess I don't have on this page, but PFAS, because you could get a test question that comes up that way, and you have to know what it stands for. So personal fall arrest system includes the body harness and the belts, and it includes lanyards that you connect to the body harness, and it includes deceleration devices, which could be that same lanyard, or it could be the self-retracting self-retracting lifeline. It can also be some kinds of rope are classified as deceleration devices depending on the length of it. If you get tied off to a rope grab system where you've got this long rope for a lifeline, there can be a certain amount of bungee cord effect to it that allows you to decelerate. The anchoring device, whatever you tie off to, is part of your personal fall arrest system. And so, again, you've got to select an anchor point that's effective. We can call an anchor point a place that you're tying off to, a beam, a column, a hook of some kind. It could also be called a tie-off point. Okay. So we've seen these pictures already. Sliding back D-ring allows the arresting force to be distributed throughout the body through all of those webs. So you basically have about a 4 or 5 point harness, depending how you look at it here in this picture, distributing that weight throughout your body. And then the lanyard, every component within your personal fall arrest system has to be able to support 5,000 pound or a 5,000 pound tensile strength, they sometimes would say. So I took this picture. I originally was taking a picture of 3 people in a work basket, and by the time I was really ready to take my pictures, this guy that's up on the roof had left the basket. So at least he's tied off up there, but he's got so much lanyard, so much rope, that he would hit the ground, because the peak of the roof is only a few feet to the left of him there, where he could fall straight to the ground. And amazing, when I pull out my camera on these job sites, I'm careful to stay off the property, but it got a good lens, and sure enough, I got about 3 pictures in before they were all gone for coffee break real quick. And the superintendent come to ask me if I could help him. He had this great big sigh of relief when he realized I wasn't an OSHA inspector. Anyways, fun and games. When you're dressed up nice and take pictures at a job site, they fear who you are. Okay, more pictures here. I'll show you the yo-yo here in just a minute, or the self-retracting lifeline. But look at this picture. You got roofers with fall protection. That doesn't happen all the time. It should, but it doesn't. Here we go. So this yellow beam, I-beam, has a tie-off point that's actually on rollers, so you can roll that thing side to side and be tied directly overhead as long as he's near that beam. But what's connected to that is the self-retracting lifeline system that retracts in and out as he needs the extra length, and then retracts as he doesn't need it. So it stays somewhat tight, snug tight. But if you were to suddenly drop it would lock just like a seatbelt. So deceleration devices limit the arresting force that a worker is subjected to, and a rope grab is what you see over on the right-hand side. That's a rope that it connects to and it locks. And so those are very simple devices that work quite well as long as you have the right kind of rope and it's tied off properly. So rope grabs and self-retracting lifelines, or yo-yos, are two very common deceleration devices. And even on this this picture of the rope grab on the right-hand side of the page here, he's got the bundled up another deceleration device built into the lanyard. Okay, so lifelines, they can be vertical or they can be horizontal. So over on the left, you've got a vertical picture where it's designed to lock just like the rope grab would. In other words, it goes up with you as you climb the ladder, so that if you slip and fall on this straight ladder, that it's going to lock and save you from yourself. And meanwhile, over on the left-hand, that was on the left-hand side, I'm sorry, he's also connected to a D-ring on the front, as opposed to the D-ring up at the back of the lanyard, where you normally connect to at the back between his shoulder blades. He's connected to a front one. You are allowed to do that when you're climbing vertically with a vertical lifeline like this. Or you could have a self-retracting lifeline that's yo-yo, that's up at the top and pulled out so that you can go up and down that way. But anyway, so on the right-hand side picture, you've got a structural steel building where they very, very commonly put a couple of cables going through the steel columns and make them high, very tight, so that it gives you your top rail and mid rail. And then behind him is a wood structure that they often will use that butts up against the back of the columns, and that gives them a toe board system. So anchoring devices, commonly called tie-off points, support the entire weight of the fall arrest system and the person being held on it and such. You got to make sure that whatever you use to tie off is reliable for the application. You see over on the synthetic strap over on the left-hand side, it's got a protective strap that's part of it to keep it from getting sliced. And so you can't just take nylon rope and strap it over a beam. That edge of the beam can be sharp enough when there's enough force on it to slice through. And that's something without a little bit of experience, it's hard to imagine how that is. But when I would try to pull people out of a snowbank with nylon rope, if there was any sharp objects at all that I had tied to under the car up in Canada, then that rope would slice. I think that every building should have a tie-off point that's permanently part of it. So then that would probably have to be made of something like stainless steel, or a high-strength steel. Doesn't corrode much either. But anyways, what you see over on the left-hand side of this page is a temporary device that's meant to be nailed, actually screwed down to a roof system up on the roof. And you're supposed to put a screw in every single hole on that one. Selecting the anchorage point, well, it should be directly above the worker, not way over the side, no more than 2 feet away horizontally. It should be easily accessible. It should be damage-free and capable of supporting 5,000 pounds per worker attached to it. It should be high enough to keep the worker from striking the lower level. Oh, and it should be separate from the work basket tie-off. So what does that mean? Well, if you're coming up to some elevation in a work basket of some kind of an extendable lift of some kind, you're tied off to the work basket while you're in there. When you go to climb out of there onto the roof, you have to tie off to a separate tie-off point on that roof system instead. So that means that you really have to have 2 lanyards on you. So that's what the front D-rings of a safety harness are used for mostly, is tying off your extra lanyard, your second lanyard, so that you've got it handy to tie out, to connect onto somewhere. You shouldn't have to disconnect your only tie-off, your only lanyard from something to connect it somewhere else, because for those moments you're not protected. So that's why it needs to be separate. Safety nets. Now we're talking about safety nets. So safety nets should be installed as close as possible to where you're working, so you don't have to fall very far, right? But no more than 30 feet. So 30 feet's a good long distance. On a lot of houses, that's 3 stories of a building, you know. So no more than 30 feet beneath the work area. But a best practice is to have it as close as possible. So depending on the actual vertical distance from you to the net should extend out beyond the edge of the building or the structure to catch you, 8 to 13 feet beyond the edge. So depending how far below. So if you're only 5 feet, if the net's only 5 feet below you, you can have the arms extend only 8 feet. But if it's anything more than 10 feet extended, then you need to have arms extended 13 feet. Now the other thing you need to remember is the mesh openings on these nets. The maximum dimension of the sides of those little squares of the net are 6 inches. So a 6-inch by 6-inch square for the net size is what you should have. You can have smaller, but it can't be any bigger than 6 inches. And sometimes you'll see even talk about 36 square inches, but that's the same thing. It's 6 inches on a square. 6 inches times 6 inches is 36 square inches. But I would say that the most important thing to remember is the 6-inch number here. Now, some of these numbers, well, like the arms sticking out, let's look at that here. There's a table here that's showing that. But I would like you to know that there's such thing as a drop test that's supposed to be performed every time you set up a safety net. You're supposed to take a 400-pound bag of sand, or maybe, if that's not possible, maybe a collection of sandbags that are all tied together that weighs 400 pounds, and you drop it into the net. Just test the net out to see how if it was strong enough. And you don't want it to distort so much that the person still hits the ground. You know, there's this hammock effect in the net that when you land in there, the net's going to go down and it's going to change shape. Well, you got to test to make sure that it's not going to still smack the ground or something else like that as it's deforming as you land in it. So you're supposed to actually put that test bag, 400-pound bag of sand, dropped from at least 42 inches above the net, or from the highest walking and working surface above the net that anybody could be working at. Rescue after the fall. Well, every elevated job site should have an established rescue and retrieval plan, just like they did at Our Lady of the Lake Hospital for those guys that were dangling after falling. Planning is especially important in remote areas where help is not readily available. So what you're supposed to really have on your site is a davit or davit arm. It says D-A-V-I-T here in the brackets at the bottom of the page there. But it's basically a portable hoist crane system that's designed to be used in multiple locations so that you can attach it to somebody and rescue them, hoist them up, or sometimes lower you down. So these two are installing decking of some sort. There's some safety issues I could mention here, but they are tied off to a horizontal lifeline, so that part is appropriate. If maybe the lifeline should be tighter than it is here, that could be a complaint. And then somebody decided to sit on a skylight, and this was actually resulted in a fatality because that was his hat sitting out there. That literally did a somersault. He was one of these things about these skylights is some of them can be strong enough to kind of stand on when they're brand new, maybe. But the sun deteriorates this plastic. These are plastic members here, you know, the skylight. And so you can't trust it, especially after it's been out in the sun for a period of time. They deteriorate, has no strength left. Floor holes, and I talked about them before, but a floor hole is small enough that you can trip and your whole leg could go in there, where the least dimension is between 1 inch and 12 inches, and we call it a floor hole. Now, so these are all these edges here, because of the way the planks are positioned, would be considered floor holes. But meanwhile, a floor opening is big enough that a whole entire person can fall through. So when the least dimension is 12 inches or more, then we consider it to be a floor opening. Well, here's another job site that I made people get an instant coffee break from. There was about a half a dozen welders up here, welding and helpers, maybe 8 people altogether, up on the edge of this roof where this guy's standing. He's the only one that didn't get the message. He was still busy. I ended up pulling out my camera too quickly, and sure enough, people saw the camera and they ran for the coffee break real quick. And so this was the only guy that didn't get the memo. He was still sitting there, or standing there, doing his thing and not paying attention to me. But you can see what kind of welding gear they had on. Pretty pathetic. They're supposed to have, had a welding helmet, but he had dinky little leather gloves on. No proper gear to catch any ember, so there's plenty of places on his loose-fitting clothing for embers to get caught in pockets and everything else. Here's a homeowner down below and a couple of workers up top with their safety cushions and all. So there's another picture I took that right from the truck. Didn't even stop and park or anything. Look at these two crazy pictures. The one on the right, this guy's got a little contraption across a corner there. The one on the left, though, my goodness, that guy is on the window ledge, and then you see where the window ledge really is. That's crazy. So I don't know if he was just a homeowner, or whether he was, the resident or what, but he didn't like the spot on the mark. Anyways, here's something that I've maybe shown in a couple of different presentations, but it's about a 12-12 slope on this roof, I would say, is my guess. And so it's pretty steep. And you can see that there's a guy on a ladder climbing with a bundle of shingles on his shoulder. And there's no safety harnesses on this job site. There's ropes that are tied to the roof peak, though. And so as he gets up on the roof and everybody else, they would hang on to these ropes. So yeah, they're all hanging on the ropes while they do the work. But that's not considered an appropriate fall arrest system or fall protection system of any kind. And yet nothing goes wrong because, they've got lots of skills too. So, but still, all it takes is one bad day, one bad moment, and you're off that thing. 12-12 roof is really a self-cleaning roof. The leaves can't stay on the roof, and neither can roofers without a lot of effort. So I mentioned how there were classes of fall protection. So class 1 here is all listed here. That's the regular body belt that's not allowed to be used for anything but fall restraint. Positioning only, not for protection. So it's kind of like a dog on a leash, kept from getting somewhere where the dog can get hurt. Class 2 is meant for rescues. It's a chest harness that you can put on somebody when they're unconscious and you can still, or hurt, and you can rescue them that way. So sometimes they are used for rescues. And then class 3 is the regular everyday body harness that we mostly use in construction, but it's only designed for falls, not for supporting your weight while you work. And then the class 4 harness is the suspension harness that can actually be used to support you while you work and for fall protection. Okay, there's a couple other terms in here, but I guess I can skip past that. And all this has been pretty much defined. So this is where you go if you accidentally drive off the side edge of my brother's driveways, his driveway. So it's probably about 100 feet of elevation overall that you drop into water. There's a pond down below too. So there's some team-based scaffolding. Get your buddy down there to dangle to paint that last little bit in the corner. So with that, I've always got this summary at the end of these presentations. So, ramps and runways are both likely to present fall hazards. Remember, the arresting force is the force that needed to stop a person from falling. All of the following are considered personal fall arrest system components of the equipment. There's the body harness, there's a lanyard, there's a lifeline. And then the sliding back D-ring allows the arresting force to be distributed throughout the body. And then over here, a personal positioning system. A personal positioning system should not allow a worker to fall more than 2 feet. So there's a number. Again, every time there's a number, you've got to make sure you really know that number and its context. The second bullet here, 2 common deceleration devices would be rope grabs and self-retracting lifelines. The next point, an anchoring device is often called a tie-off point. And the next bullet down, D-rings must have a minimum tensile strength of 5,000 pounds for each worker attached. And then the next one, it is not safe to make an anchorage point the same as a work basket tie-off. And the last bullet here, mesh openings in a safety net are limited to 6 inches on the sides. So 6 inches by 6 inches in those squares. And finally, here's my last picture here. These guys are on top of a tall high-rise, and then they're on top of a tower that is on top of that high-rise. So they're a good ways up. But somebody else mentioned that, well, there's one person who's higher up than they are, and that's the guy taking the picture. So I guess that's true too. Okay, well, that's enough for fall protection. Now we're going to move on to ladders, stairways, and eventually after that, scaffolding.